The Education of OverSoul7 by Jane Roberts, read by Martin John. Chapter 3, Maha's Trek, The Earthization of OverSoul7, Part 2 of the Examination. OverSoul7 and Cyprus were 2 points of light. I choose Lydia's study for our discussion for several reasons, Cyprus said. For one thing, the next part of your examination will definitely be Earth-oriented, and in ways that you may not suspect. Suspect, OverSoul7 said. I don't like the implications of that word. Are you sure you're using the language properly? Yes, I am, and I use the word purposely to give you a clue as to what might happen, she said. For another thing, we have to take Earth forms, invisible, of course. And I want you to relate to the environment the way humans do. For example, let's get off the windowsill and move properly into the room. We'll sit in one of those chairs there. Now, tell me precisely where and when we are, Cyprus said. She materialized, to 7 at least, as a young woman of mature years, or as a mature woman of young years. Either way it seemed to fit. Yet if you kept looking at her, she became a young man of mature years, or a mature man of young years. She laughed. It's according to which part of my personality you focus on. I'm not as Earth-oriented as you, and I just can't get all of myself into an exclusively male or female form. No one ever does, of course. At my level, it's just more apparent. But what form do you want to adopt? She asked. You'll have to use it for all of our discussions, so make up your mind. For one thing, I want to see how good you are remembering details. 7's point of light wiggled indecisively. I hadn't counted on a test of form, he said, but since details are important, I'll pick something with as few of them as possible. What about a glowing round orange ball? No, she sighed, a human form. 7 grinned and adopted the 14-year-old guise he'd used in the first part of the examination. Now, to answer your questions, he said briskly. This is a day in April in the year 1975 in the northeastern part of the United States, which is a country, and it's 4 o'clock. Oh, I see, Cyprus said. 4 o'clock is in the United States, then? Not exactly. Well, yes and no, 7 said. It's 4 o'clock here in the study, but that doesn't mean that 4 o'clock is here. If you can't explain when we are and how when fits into where, no wonder you have trouble keeping track of your personalities, Cyprus said. But never mind. I have something quite serious to discuss with you. I'm giving you a multiple choice section next, so listen carefully. 7 frowned, but Cyprus continued. The second part of the examination was dependent upon your performance in the first part, she said, though, as you know, all of it is really taking place at once. But several things have become apparent. I feel as if I know Lydia and Joseph much better than I do Proteus, and Maha I know hardly at all. 7 said. He sat docilely enough in his best 14-year-old male form, but he was beginning to feel a flash of irritation. Could it be that you didn't tune into Proteus and Maha as well as you did the others? Cyprus said. You couldn't get away from Maha fast enough, it seemed to me. It's just them, Seven answered, rather put out now. Proteus is gloomy a good deal of the time. Maha sees me as an old man always. I told you that, and she always wants me to do something boring, like keeping watch over the cave. Well, she's quite demanding. I'm afraid that you've been a very distant oversoul to both of them, Cyprus said severely. That's one of the issues we hope to take care of in this examination. You have to learn to relate to your personalities better. And why do you think Maha sees you as an old man? Never mind, don't answer me now. And she doesn't see you as a jolly old man either, which would be something quite different. No, Seven, those qualities you see in Maha and Proteus are your own too, a fact that you conveniently forget. And you don't come to grips with them at all. But I'm not gloomy, OverSoul7 cried, or demanding either. You can only endow your personalities with your own attributes. They're born from your own joy and vitality and creativity, but they also have your characteristics. You're their raw material, so to speak. I don't like that phrase much either, Seven said. I like to think of myself as their creator, or of them as my creations. Just as I thought, Cyprus said. Oh, Seven, I don't know how you'll ever reach OverSoul8 stage. You're leading up to something, Seven said, and you tricked me into making my last statement. You tricked yourself into that, she said. But the fact is that you don't relate well to Proteus and Maha at all. And worse, you're playing favorites. As a result, both of them are missing something important that only you can give them. They're each missing a part of their soul. Seven was so upset that his image blurred around the edges. Watch your form, Cyprus corrected. There you go again. Details are important too. I don't mean to be overly severe, but suppose something like that happened to Maha or Joseph. Joseph would get out of it somehow, Seven said. But Maha wouldn't. You're just trying to confuse me, Seven wailed. This must be your low point, Cyprus said dryly. Oversouls don't cry. I'm not crying, I'm wailing. There's a difference, Seven said. Anyway, why not? He added defiantly. Because when they're using all their abilities, then they see more clearly. And they know that there are no obstacles, only those you believe in. But never mind. Here's part 2 of your examination. It's an in-depth life composition. OverSoul7 regained his composure. You have a choice between Maha and Proteus, Cyprus said, but you must focus your attention on one of them and identify as best you can with whichever one you choose. It sounds easy enough, OverSoul7 said, but I have a feeling that there's something you aren't telling me. That you'll have to find out for yourself, she said. Which one do you choose? Well, I suppose I should do Maha because I relate to her poorest of all, Seven said. All right, I choose Maha. Remember, you must try to identify with her as well as you can, Cyprus said, and with that portion of you from which she came. Good luck, dear Seven. Cyprus, wait! I've a lot of questions. Oh, it's you again, old man, Maha said. OverSoul7 just frowned. Cyprus was gone. Lydia's study was gone, and instead Maha stood in her spirit body outside of her everlasting cave. "Why do you always see me as an old man?" he asked. "If you're not one, why do you look like one?" she retorted. "I don't look like one. That's the point," he said. She shrugged. "I don't care if you do or don't, but at least you could be pleasant." "I'm trying to be," he said irritably. "And I'm apt to be around for some time. So I wish... Oh, never mind." "This is a great start," he said to himself. But Maha had already gone back into her body. She didn't have the greatest disposition in the world, Seven thought, looking about. The cold wind swept scraps of dry weed past his face, and the cliffs were white with frost. Seven sighed. She didn't have the greatest environment in the world either. The cliffs rose straight up in the air, making dry, curious noises as if the rocks were coughing. Seven was impervious to the weather, but he found the view fascinating, and he entertained himself by dematerializing from the valley, appearing on a cliff peak and looking down at where he'd just been. Then, guiltily, he remembered his instructions. "Identify as best you can with Maha," Cyprus had said. Clearly, he thought, she had something else in mind. Uneasily, he went into Maha's cave. She lay asleep on a few hides, bundled in another that was used as cloak and cover. Her brown straight hair was matted, all emphasis gone from her dark face, making her look vulnerable and more like 12 than the 20 Earth years she had to her credit. Seven sighed again. Cyprus was right. He had maintained too great a distance. Unaccountably, he felt suddenly drawn to Maha, as he never had been before. At the same time, a curious lassitude possessed him. He saw Maha's mate, Rampa, sleeping beside her. But then, without warning, he felt Rampa's breath coming in warm waves down at his own face, astoundingly close. His viewpoint changed too. Rampa was now beside him. Beside Maha! He was feeling Rampa's breath from Maha's body, because he was in Maha's body. How odd settling down into a real body was. Maha wasn't aware of him, of course. Since he was Maha and Maha was himself, there was no conflict. Yet so far she only knew herself as Maha, and him as the old man when she was out of her body. Seven was confused. He tried to get his thoughts in order, in one way. Then, he thought, he was getting to know himself better by getting to know her. Still, Seven's consciousness wiggled uneasily. To be confined to one body for all practical purposes. It wouldn't be like changing forms whenever you wanted to, as he did. To have the responsibility for keeping the same body going all the while. The details involved really threw him for a loop when he thought of it. Of course, his energy helped maintain her body to begin with. His was the spark, so to speak, from which her body grew, from which her spirit had come. But he stopped that line of thought, aware of the strangest ambiguity. Being in a real body was so intimate. He could feel his consciousness nestling in all the atoms and molecules. He was aware of their million separate yet combined consciousnesses, so tumultuous, like the infinite buzzing of innumerable bees, warm, too close, throbbing. For a moment he felt frightened, confined. On the other hand, he was transfixed,
fascinated,
attracted to the body experience as to a magnet. He'd never allowed himself to enter the complete physical experience of one of his personalities before. For one thing, he'd never been invited. But suddenly it occurred to him that far more than that was involved. All oversouls were individual and related to their personalities in their own fashion. He was adventurous, and he'd set himself and his personalities some great challenges. But the truth was, he didn't want to get too involved. Worse, he was beginning to suspect that his personalities were setting him some challenges too. Like right now, this full alliance with flesh and blood was startling, pleasant and unpleasant, and it was growing more unpleasant each minute. He felt clotted, thickened, caught in a rich, dizzy gestalt of interaction. That was enough of that. Seven roused himself, but nothing happened. His consciousness was intact, whole, itself, yet it was somehow dispersed throughout Maha's body, stuck in the cells and wiggly organs, locked
in labyrinthine,
tangled chambers of bone and blood. The body's left shoulder was cold. That's what cold was. He knew the meaning of the word, but the feeling of draft, of empty wind blowing on exposed flesh, this was something new. Seven felt the tiny hairs on the arm raise, arch, stiffen. They stood up so taut and straight that it seemed they'd pulled right out of the flesh. Maha turned over suddenly in her sleep, shoving the shoulder beneath her. The hairs instantly softened. Seven groaned. Maha's eyes were closed, and he didn't seem able to manufacture any vision of his own, or do anything for that matter, but experience reality through her body. "Cypress, this is too much," he called mentally, but there was no answer. He shivered, or Maha did. He wanted to turn the wind down, as he'd done before, but now he was imprisoned in Maha and at the wind's mercy as she'd been and was. "You could at least turn the wind down," he moaned to Cypress, but again there was no response. His first day was incredible. He experienced morning, noon, and night in sequence, through the body's senses as Maha did. No more mixing and matching of times and seasons. He saw the world from her viewpoint. That is, he saw only what she saw, though he could interpret events in his own way. He never felt so limited. He couldn't get out of Maha's day, no matter how he tried. By late afternoon, it was already growing dark. Again the wind began rising. A low moon appeared on the horizon. Maha and Rampa finished eating some particularly bitter roots that they'd gathered during the day. The remainder they strapped about their waists with a rope made of tough weeds. Looking through Maha's eyes, Seven realized that they were too far away from the cave to make it back by nightfall, and the cliffs here rose straight and smooth-faced, offering no chance of shelter. The body was very cold. The hides rubbed against the skin with irritating regularity, and the hide moccasins were badly worn. The feet, Seven realized, were losing all feeling. So far the body sensations had taken all of Seven's attention. He'd never handled such a barrage of constantly applied stimuli without being able to shut it off at will. He heard what Maha said to Rampa, but he was so engrossed in the tongue's feelings and the sensations involved in speech, the rush of air through the throat, that he ignored the conversation itself. Didn't she know the feet were near frozen? Didn't she know that the body needed help? Then, as if in answer to his questions, Maha's emotions avalanched upon his consciousness, only they snuffed his out. He could feel his own awareness disappear beneath sudden fear, anger. The words and feelings instantly translated. It's Rampa's fault. I shouldn't have listened to him. I knew we went too far. My feet, and he's limping. The emotions immediately transformed the body. The shoulders slumped, the mouth drooped, the blood was called to many places at once. The belly swelled, gas collected. Seven felt himself crushed, threatened to extinction. Scared silly, Cypress would say later. But he roused himself, pulled himself up from the maze of Mahaness. He knew something important. What was it? Desperately he tried to make a small point of silence, a framework to hold him above all that tumult. He knew what to do and where to go, if only he could make himself remember. The confusion of body noises, activity, and emotions was still there. But Seven hung his consciousness above it all somewhere, like a spider in the rafters of a high ceiling, and brooded. Maha trudged on. Seven distinguished her voice now from the other jungled of vowels, syllables, gurgles, and body sounds, keeping track of what activity was happening inside her and what originated from without. Rampa's voice, coming from the outside, definitely affected the inside of Maha's body, though. Whenever Rampa spoke, a variety of mixed responses were aroused in Maha's consciousness, and each of these had instant physical repercussions. Her emotions rose and fell in such staggered rhythm that for a moment Seven confused it with the rise and fall the thighs made in walking. But he managed to cling to the precarious nest of silence he'd made, and he concentrated as hard as he could. Unfamiliar webs of energy grew from his alertness. He could feel them. They went stretching out into the night, searching. Finally, they pointed clearly to the southeast. But why? What did they mean? Seven only knew that he must follow them. Their body fell down. Again, without knowing how he did it, Seven picked the body up and started it walking once more. All the while, he kept concentrating. What was it he knew and had forgotten? The webs of light moved again. They converged on one particular cliff not too far away, and suddenly the rock became transparent to Seven. Within it he glimpsed light, distance, and activity. Seven grappled with the problem. He knew he had to get Rampa and Maha over to that cliff. He tried to signal her mentally. Maha, Maha, this way. Nothing. She kept trudging on, half crying with frustration and cold. Seven's own sense of futility was almost more than he could bear. He was afraid he'd fall back into the tumult of her body and emotions again. Fighting for control, he felt his separate consciousness slipping, and as he lost his hard-won isolation, he was Maha. "Oh, we've got to get to that cliff," she thought frantically. She signaled Rampa. She'd been acting so strangely all day that Rampa nodded, half out of sheer exhaustion, and half in surprise that she seemed to be so sure of herself. Maha clenched her teeth in determination. At the same time, she wondered why the cliff was so important and how she knew that they must reach it. Both of them had just slumped against the rock when they got there. Maha cried with exasperation. Whatever she'd had in mind, the cliff was smooth, unbroken. Her disappointment smothered her. She was too tired to go on. Her thoughts grew hazy, and Seven found his own consciousness once more suspended somewhere within Maha, but apart. He experimented cautiously, stood the body up, opened its eyes, and felt the cliff walls with his hands. For this, in his predicament anyhow, he needed the hands' sensitivity. But Maha's fingers found the spot the Seven was seeking, and the door that he'd somehow known was there opened. Seven pulled the body in. He couldn't work Rampa's body from the inside, and Rampa didn't seem able to work it much himself. Worse, Seven knew that the door would close automatically in only a few seconds, and his own energy was fluctuating. One instant everything was brilliantly clear, the next his awareness dimmed. Seven cried out, "Rampa!" But the words came out of Maha's lips in her voice. Rampa raised his head and half rose, dragging himself over. As soon as he was inside, the door closed. From that higher point of awareness, Seven thought smugly, "I should get an A on that part of the examination." Then, confused, he wondered what he meant. End chapter. Peace, light, and love. Aloha.